This is the farmhouse where I grew up, where my father grew up, where my grandfather grew up, where my great-grandfather grew up. The main house was built in 1860. We got electricity in 1943 with the Rural Electrification Act. And now what I am doing is I'm removing the majority of the 1960 updates and reverting the era back to somewhere between 1920 and 1950. I'm going to show you each room in the order that I did them years ago. While I am no more of a carpenter or a designer than any member of my family has ever been, I'm doing it to suit me and my tastes. The last book I showed you how we redid the porch, at least the one end. Now I'm going to show you what we did with the other end by the doors. Now if you recall back in book 6, we had the original opening to the house. We took down the closet and took out that door, and what we did was in an outbuilding we found the original door that was a storm door that was on the outside. So we decided to take that and use that as the door that would lead from the what we're calling the cloakroom to the living room. And as you can see here, we are beginning to clean up the door. It was quite dirty. So you wipe it down initially to get the dirt off it. Then we discovered the finish was shellac. So to refresh a shellac finish, all you have to do is take a cloth or a sponge with alcohol and go over it, and it will remove the top layer and clean it up, and you can see that it looked very, very good at that point. And then when we're done, we went over it with one more coat of amber shellac, which was what they would have had back then. They wouldn't use clear, and that was what we kept for the door. And here you can see the door mounted back in its original position, and you can see it was the original door because it fits perfectly. And here is the living room side of the door. Now to get started on the actual cloakroom itself. Because it was an open porch, the floor sloped towards the outside. So I had to cut a bunch of shims and lay them on the floor so that when we did put plywood down, the floor would be level. And if you notice that square by the door, that is the original closet. And beyond that was that wasted space against the window. So we started by laying down a sheet of 1/2-inch plywood on top of those shims to give us a level base. And then I cut a little hole in what used to be the outside of the house just to see what was inside that wall. And that will be important later on. And then for floor insulation, I laid down a sheet of 1-inch rigid polyiso insulation with the aluminum reflector up, and then laid another sheet of plywood. This time it was 3/8 plywood on top of the insulation, and that was on top of the original 1/2-inch sheet of plywood. And this sandwich was then screwed together, and you would think that the insulation would crush, but it doesn't, and it does create a nice warm insulated floor. And then we turned our attention to the outside wall where that little knee wall was. We had to put in some new 2x4s so that we could get the nailing spacing just right. And then we added some insulation. And with that triple track window removed, we put in a sheet of plywood and then some 2x4s to frame out the window that we're going to put in. And then using a router, I routed the window hole following the frame. You can see we've got the window frame in and the insulation and the beadboard below the knee wall, just like we did with the rest of the porch. And here is the window installed in the frame and all the trim done. And now it was time to put up the wall between the cloakroom and the porch. So if you notice the bottom plate, it's a 2x4 that's on edge. There's a reason for that. We had to have a certain width inside the cloakroom because of something we wanted to fit in there. You'll see that in Chapter 5 of the cloakroom. So we decided to build a sideways wall. So here I am putting the upper beam in to hold the wall boards. And then just like with the porch, we put in 2 inches of the rigid polyiso insulation, which according to specification, it is 96% efficient at preventing heat from escaping or preventing heat from coming in during the summer. And here you can see the sideways wall is starting to go in. Normally you have your 2x4s turned the other way, but because of space constraints, we were putting it in sideways. It's unusual, but it does work. And she who must be obeyed decided we needed a clerestory window in the wall going between the cloakroom and the porch. So we had a piece of 1-inch insulated glass cut for us, and I framed to that window and used silicone seal. We sealed the window into the frame. And then same as the porch, we put up Luan plywood and then took some leftover ceiling from the kitchen and started putting it up. And then we, before we finished the ceiling, we ran some wires for the switch and the ceiling light in the cloakroom. Here you can see the finished ceiling. We had a lot of leftover wood from the kitchen ceiling because of all the problems we had with the wood. There was 4 different shipments, so we had a lot of little pieces, so we were just reusing what we had to put up the ceiling, and it worked. So then as a mounting point for the cloakroom ceiling light, we took one of the old porch ceiling joists down. Instead of throwing them all away, we kept one, and then I used a router to route a channel for the wires to run on top so you would not see them from below. And then we nailed it back into position like it would have been before the ceiling was put up. And of course we used the original cut nails so that it would all look period, that it had never been removed. And then we started putting up beadboard on the inside of the cloakroom. As you can see here, this is the view from the porch. And here's a view of the beadboard from the inside of the cloakroom. And here's a view from the porch door looking straight through into the kitchen. We wanted a straight shot, and that's why we went to all this work. And then the space between the sideways beams was filled with 1 inch of the rigid polyiso insulation. And then that silver paint that you see on the sideways 2x4s, that is NASA shuttle paint. It's the insulating paint that they used on the shuttle. And then the lower part of the wall, we put in insets of beadboard with a little decorative trim on top. Above that was Luan plywood. This stuff was, both top and bottom, were glued to the rigid insulation using Loctite power grab. And here's the beadboard that has been primed, ready for paint. And there's the bottom section, painted the porch yellow. And that is how we created the initial space for the cloakroom.